About a month ago, I released a video about disturbing Reddit posts. Those of you who watched it may remember a story about a man who found out that his entire life hadn't really happened, and that he'd been living in a phantom reality. It's incredibly rare, but when this happens, a person could live out what seems like days, weeks, even years, only to suddenly be snapped back into reality. Not much research has been done on the subject, but it's believed that after a large amount of DMT is released in your brain after, say, a near-death experience, it's possible to fall into this other life state. In other cases, people seem to remember a past life that they never had, or at least believe they never had. This is a story told to me by my friend, and he maintains that it's completely true. He knew one of the people involved. I've heard of things like this happening before, and it's as interesting as it is disturbing to think about. It might start to sound a bit crazy, but stick with it. This story's about a 28-year-old guy called Kevin, as well as Kevin's girlfriend, another man named Bruce, and his girlfriend too. It was a weekend night in the midst of summer, and the two couples had been on a trip to the beach. Kevin had his own motorbike, and the rest were in a car being driven by Bruce. It was getting late, and there were no other cars in sight, so Bruce challenges Kevin to a race back home. Stupid? Sure, but there wasn't far to go, and the road seemed deserted. Bruce and Kevin's apartments were in the same building. In fact, that was how they originally met, and they became close quickly. Not a guy to turn down a challenge, the engine roars, and Kevin's bike starts to accelerate. The first to arrive back was the car. At this point, it was around midnight. Elated, Bruce and his girlfriend jump out of the car and head right back to their room. But Kevin's girlfriend was worried. She knew that Kevin was a whiz on his bike. He should have arrived back way before them. She called him a couple of times, but assuming he was busy driving, she left a voicemail and headed upstairs. A few hours later, there was a fierce knocking on the door. Bruce and his girlfriend were standing outside with forlorn faces. Bruce opens up his mouth to speak, but the words won't come out. Eventually, it was his girlfriend who spoke up. Kevin got into an accident on the way back. He's dead. Kevin had approached a sharp bend in the road too quickly, and the rest goes without saying. Like I said, she was worried before, and the prospect had occurred to her, but she had just willed herself into believing that couldn't be the case. But it was. She just fell to the floor in tears. They tried to console her as best as they could, but that was when Bruce said something very strange. "Listen, don't freak out, but I think the cops may have made a mistake. See, Kevin came by our room." The pair were shivering despite the hot summer air. Kevin's mum had just called us up and told us what happened. I told her we'd break the news to you. When I hung up, we heard a knocking at the door. We asked who it was, and it was Kevin. We thought he was playing some kind of sick joke on us at first, but his mum wouldn't have lied about something like that. We were scared, so we didn't open the door. Eventually, we heard footsteps, and he went away. She, of course, couldn't believe what they had told her, but they were being deadly serious. They both seemed convinced that Kevin's ghost had come to say goodbye or something. Even if they really believe that to be the case, it still seems like a pretty insensitive thing to say to someone who's just lost their boyfriend. But what's weirder is that before they left, They said that if Kevin came knocking on her door, she mustn't open it, no matter what, like a warning. Needless to say, this whole ordeal freaked her the hell out. In shock, she spent the whole next day locked in her room, mourning the death of Kevin. Eventually, she managed to cry herself to sleep. That night, she woke up to the sound of knocking. Thinking that her mind was playing tricks on her, she pulled the bedsheets over herself and desperately tried to fall back into sleep. The knocking continued, and this time, whoever was knocking spoke. "Hey, it's me. Open the door." It was unmistakably Kevin's voice. Crazy, right? Well, that's the thing. Though it obviously made no logical sense, the whole scenario somehow felt completely natural to her. She approached the door carefully, compelled to answer his call. The closer she got to the door, the more she felt Kevin's presence. "Please, open the door." She felt tears brimming up as she reached for the handle. But this was nuts. After all, he was dead. She desperately tried to communicate with Kevin, or whoever or whatever was behind the door. "You're already dead," she shouted. The knocking got louder. "You're already dead, Kevin." But the knocking continued, and the shouting just became louder and louder. She couldn't help but cry even more. The thought that Kevin may somehow still be suffering, or desperate to say goodbye, was more than she could bear. That was it. She flung open the door and shouted for him at the top of her voice. And then she woke up. She had been in a coma. When she came to, she found herself in a brightly lit hospital room. Next to her bed sat Kevin, who was crying in relief. She felt weak and couldn't comprehend what was happening. Kevin elaborated. In reality, he had arrived back at the apartment before the others, but became worried when they seemingly took forever to catch up. He went back down the same route, only to find Bruce's car obliterated just after a sharp bend. Both Bruce and his girlfriend were literally in pieces, but she somehow survived. She was the only one in the back seat. Maybe this was all just an extremely vivid and involved dream that she was having whilst in the coma. She maintains that it was undeniably more real than that she and the others were someplace else, and that Kevin hadn't come to say goodbye, but to try and bring them back. However you choose to rationalize this, she remains convinced that if she had listened to Bruce's advice and not opened the door, she wouldn't have woken up. My daughter, who's now 14 years old, has an unusual fear. When she was about 3.5, she quite eloquently explained it to me, and blew my mind. Since the time she could walk, she's had this massive fear of the television alert system. You know, when they interrupt your show to test the emergency broadcast with loud sets of beeps. It would send her into a mind-shattering state of fear and panic, and she'd be inconsolable until it was all over. She never liked too much audio stimulation, so I chalked it up to that. Until one day, when she was 3.5, and it happened while I was playing with her in her room. When it was over and she had calmed down, I simply asked why it was so scary. Her answer gave me chills. Because the last time I heard it, Mama and Papa Joe put me into the back of an ambulance, and I never saw them again. She always called me Mum, never Mama. She didn't know anyone by the name of Joe, or any Papa for that matter. and I'd never taught her the word ambulance, though she pronounced it more like ambulance. I didn't jump to any conclusions. I told her that she had never been in an ambulance, and asked who Papa Joe was. Almost frustrated with me, she answered, "Not here, before." "Before what?" I asked. "Before I was in there," she answered, pointing to my stomach. Now she had my undivided attention. I gently pressed for more information, being very careful not to lead her answers in any way. "What happened in the ambulance?" "Mama and Papa Joe were crying, and I had to say bye-bye," she answered, while calmly playing with her toy cars. "Why did you say goodbye?" "The sound on the TV. The wind whooshed and broke things. I had a real bad boo-boo, but it didn't hurt." "So why did you say bye-bye?" "My friends told me I had to go home." I began to think she may be trailing off at this point, but I was wrong. "Home? Back to Mama and Papa Joe?" Getting very frustrated with me, she said, "No, home." I decided not to push that part any further. "Okay, what did you do when you got home?" "I played, and then my friend said I need a new mum." She lifted her head up, grinning ear to ear. "So I picked you," and she wrapped her arms around me and gave me a big squeeze. The whole conversation had me mentally drained, and I left it after that for the time being. I assured her that I would never make her say bye-bye, but her fear continued. As she grew, she completely forgot everything about her former life, but the fear stayed fairly strong. We lived in New York until she was 9. Then I married, and we moved to our current home in Wyoming. Tornadoes and massive storms are fairly common in our neck of the woods, but my husband spent the first few years of our marriage holding her in his massive arms whenever the alert sounded. Eventually, she learned to simply mute the TV until it was all over, and we both felt like she was over it. About 2 months ago, the town's tornado siren alerted, and all that changed. The TVs weren't on at the time. The siren was our only warning, and our 14-year-old daughter transformed into that panicking toddler I had so often comforted. My husband, having way more experience with Wyoming's unpredictable weather, climbed to the roof and scanned the skyline, and soon after the siren had shut off, shouted the all clear. No matter what he showed her or told her, no matter how firmly he held her, it was like she was in another place and time. Her tears flowed like water, and as a mother, I felt completely helpless. Then she said something that sent chills down my spine. Despite the utter silence outside our home, she kept asking, "Do you hear an ambulance? Why is there an ambulance?" My husband knew the story, and neither believed or disbelieved, but quickly whisked her outside to show her there was no ambulance. She wasn't hurt, and she wasn't going anywhere. In fact, she was going to sit on the couch and play Madden with him. That seemed to snap her back, and after giving her time to get back to herself, I asked her what the fuss about the ambulance was. "I have no idea, Mum," was her only answer. In my last semester at college, I was assaulted by a football player for walking where he was trying to drive. He was 325 pounds, and I was only 120. I got up and brushed myself off, got on with my day and my life in general. Fast forward a year or two. I met a wonderful young lady. She made my heart skip and my face red. I pursued her for months and dispatched a few jerk boyfriends before I finally won her heart. After 2 years we got married, and almost immediately she bore me a daughter. I had a great job, and my wife didn't have to work outside the house. When my daughter was 2, my wife and I had a son. I'd walk into my children's room every morning before I went to work and doted on both of them. One day, while sitting on the couch, I noticed that the perspective of the lamp was odd, like inverted. It was still in 3D, but just wrong. I was transfixed. I couldn't look away from it. I stayed up all night staring at it. The next morning, I didn't go to work. Something was just not right about that lamp. I stopped eating. I left the couch only to use the bathroom. I stared at that fucking lamp for 3 days before my wife got really worried. She had someone come in to try and talk to me, but by this time my cognizance was breaking up and my wife was freaking out. She took the kids to her mother's house just before I had the epiphany. The lamp wasn't real. The whole house wasn't real. My wife, my kids, none of it was real. The last 10 years of my life were not fucking real. I started to hear voices, screams, all kinds of weird noises, and I became aware of a pain. A fucking shit ton of pain. The first words I said were, "I'm missing teeth." I opened my eyes. I was laying on my back on the sidewalk, surrounded by people I didn't know, most of them freaking out. I was completely confused. At some point, a cop scooped me up, dragged or walked me across the sidewalk and grass, and threw me face down in the back of a cop car. I was taken to the hospital by the cop, where CT scans were taken. I was in such a sorry state, he didn't have time to wait for an ambulance. What I thought had been my life after that college incident had all taken place in my head as I lay unconscious on the ground. I went through 3 years of horrid depression. I was grieving the loss of my wife and children, and dealing with the knowledge that they never existed. I was scared I was going insane, as I would cry myself to sleep, hoping I would see my family in my dreams. I never have, but sometimes I see my son, usually just a glimpse out of my peripheral vision. He's perpetually 5 years old, and I can never hear what he says. Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. I wasn't too sure what to title this video, to be honest, but I thought the stories were a bit different, something that hasn't really been done before, so I just wanted to get them out there. It's disturbing to think our brains can put us in this weird fake reality, but interesting nonetheless. Let's just hope you're not living in one right now. Ooh. If you enjoyed this video, then please share it around with your friends, family, hobos on the street, whoever. It all really helps the channel out, and I really appreciate it. And also make sure to do some naughty things with that like button down there. Until the next set of stories, you take care, Lazy Legion. Stay spooky, and remember, the best things happen in the dark. Wake up.